Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep into a really fascinating piece of Japanese history today. The Peace for Vietnam, Citizens Federation, better known as Beheiren.
That's right. And we've got some great source material to work with, a detailed timeline, lists of key people, and a pretty comprehensive look from Japanese Wikipedia covering the group's activities.
So our mission, really, is to use these sources to get a handle on the whole story of Beheiren. You know, how it started, what it became, why it eventually dissolved.
Exactly. And we want to zero in on what made it stand out as a citizens movement and, frankly, pull out some of the, well, surprising stuff that's in these documents.
Think of this as your guide, your way into understanding this really significant, but yeah, pretty complex anti-war movement in Japan. We're talking mid-60s to early 70s.
Right, all playing out against the backdrop of the Vietnam War.
And it's clear from the get-go, this wasn't just one single thing.
Oh, definitely not. The sources paint a picture of a real mix. Different groups, different people, doing everything from, big public marches to some pretty shadowy stuff.
So where do we start? Well, the sources actually trace the origins back even before Beheiren itself, to something called the Association of the Voiceless.
That popped up in June 1960, right in the middle of those big protests against the Onpo Treaty revision.
And it sounds like it started super small, really grassroots.
Yeah, the material points to people like Tomi Kobayashi and Mitsuo Fuwa. He was linked to the study group for the science of thought, and they did something simple but symbolic.
No, what is that?
Just protesting with a banner. It read, "Association of the Voiceless who can enter anyone." Kind of an open invitation right there.
Interesting. And that small spark grew.
It did. It eventually connected with others like Shunsuke Tsurumi and Michitoshi Takabatake, and that led to the formal setup of this Association of the Voiceless.
And they literally set up shop in Takabatake's home, according to this. Really paints a picture, doesn't it?
Absolutely. A small, dedicated group feeling, the need to speak out. But the global situation was about to change everything.
Right. Fast forward to February 1965. This is when the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces begin the sustained bombing of North Vietnam. Our sources call it the Northern Bombing.
Yeah, retaliation for attacks on bases. And the reaction, it was almost instant. Global.
Protests just started erupting everywhere.
Exactly. And that's the immediate context, this feeling that, well, whatever protest was happening in Japan, it just wasn't big enough for this.
Which leads us right to the birth of Beheiren itself. In March 65, Michitoshi Takabatake goes to Shunsuke Tsurumi.
And his thinking, apparently, was that the Association of the Voiceless, while important, was just too small, too limited to really challenge the war and Japan's support for the U.S.
So what was the big idea?
Organize a truly nonpartisan citizen protest, something broader. Tsurumi then pulls in Makoto Oda, the writer.
Ah, Oda, a key figure.
Definitely. They meet up in Tokyo, start planning this new thing.
And they move quickly. By early April 65, you've got 10 different groups meeting. The original Voiceless guys, but also Wadatsumikai, the Christian Peace Association.
Laying the groundwork for the first big demonstration.
Which they announced just a couple of weeks later, April 15th. Makoto Oda and about 20 others.
Right.
And the list of initiators is pretty striking.
Yeah, lots of cultural figures. Writers like Ken Kaiko, Yoshihara, Kazumi Takahashi, filmmakers too, Yoshida Shinoda.
So April 24th, 1965, that's the date. The first demonstration happens in Tokyo. Sources say maybe 1,500 people.
Marching under that very simple slogan, Peace for Vietnam. And you see names like Junji Kinoshita, Susumu mentioned as being there.
And critically, on that same day, Beheiren is formally established. It sort of grew out of the Association of the Voiceless.
Right. Odo becomes the representative, and it was Takabatake, apparently, who came up with the short name, Beheiren.
Now, here's something the sources really hammer home as being, well, different about Beheiren. Its structure, or maybe the lack of it.
Exactly. No formal rules, no membership lists. It was defined simply by who showed up and took part.
Come as you are, leave as you please. That's the phrase they use.
Yeah. Oda himself apparently called it a connection between serious groups, political groups, and even his words, phony citizens, whatever that meant.
It implies a real openness, maybe even a chaotic mix.
Totally. You had your established left-wing groups, unions, student organizations, but also just tons of individuals, students, office workers, housewives.
People just motivated by the cause itself, maybe not by any specific ideology.
Seems like it. And what's really fascinating, the sources point out it wasn't just leftists.
Like who?
Well, Kenryo Sato, a former Imperial Army general, he was critical of the U.S., so he got involved. And even Ryumaru Sugiyama, who is linked to the right-wing Jinyosha group, he's listed as an early initiator.
Wow. So the anti-war feeling, initially at least, cut across some pretty deep political divides.
It seems so. Though Sugiyama's stance apparently changed later on.
Okay, so Beheiren gets founded, and they hit the ground running.
Absolutely. 2 days later, April 26th, they're joining national rallies in like 25 places, organizing a sit-in at the U.S. Embassy, no messing around.
And leadership changes happen pretty early, too.
Yeah, Kubo steps down, and Yuichi Yoshikawa becomes Secretary General. He had actually been expelled from the Japan Communist Party. You also had members from the Communist Workers' Party, a new left group, getting involved.
They seem to have been good at grabbing attention. High-profile stuff.
Definitely. Like getting Kenryo Sato, the former general, to speak out against the U.S. at a meeting in August 65. And the newspaper ads were a big deal.
Right, Ken Kaiko suggested that. First in the New York Times in November 65.
And then that really powerful one in the Washington Post in April 67 with the huge Kill No visual by Taro Okamoto.
That must have made waves.
You'd think so. And they were building international links, too, hosting famous visitors.
Like Sergeant de Beauvoir.
Yeah, October 66. They were visiting Japan anyway, but Beheiren hosted a discussion meeting with them. Drew about 1,000 people, apparently, followed by a demo.
And Joan Baez, too, in January 67.
Held a meeting with her during her tour. Tomoya Takaishi, the Japanese folk singer, performed too. These events really boosted their profile.
It seems like the appeal went beyond the usual activist crowd. You mentioned a boys' magazine.
Yeah, the sources say it got covered there. And get this, they apparently received donations from police officers and even self-defense force members.
Seriously, why?
Well, the interpretation in the sources is that maybe these people supported the idea of a moderate, citizen-led anti-war stance, even if they weren't politically aligned with the left wing generally.
Interesting. They were connecting with anti-war groups in the U.S. as well.
Yeah, building those transatlantic bridges.
But okay, as the movement grew, things started to change. Got a bit more intense.
Yeah, that seems to be the pattern. Autumn 67, they're protesting Prime Minister Sato's trip to Southeast Asia. And the sources note that as demos got bigger, some people started using more radical tactics.
Like what?
Like building barricades during the big anti-war day protests on October 21st, 1969.
And that had consequences, right?
It did. The sources directly link that kind of radical action to the Tokyo authorities banning a planned protest in November 69. That was against Sato's visit to the U.S., a really key moment.
So you see the tension there, keeping a broad movement together when tactics start diverging.
Exactly, which maybe leads into this next phase, the more secret side of things.
Yes, the deserter support network.
Right. A core group within Beheiren started, helping U.S. military deserters, conscientious deserters, they called them, get out of Japan. Illegally, the sources stress.
And this wasn't under the main Beheiren banner?
No, it was separate. Operated under the name JTEC, Japan Technical Committee to Aid Anti-War GIs. Ichiyamuto apparently came up with the name.
And there was a specific incident that brought this out into the open.
Yes, October 17th, 1967. 4 sailors from the aircraft carrier USS Intrepid. They deserted while the ship was in Yokosuka.
Michael Lindner, Craig Anderson, Richard Bailey, John Barilla, the Intrepid 4.
That's them. And the sources state Beheiren members took them in, sheltered them.
And instead of keeping it quiet,
they went public, big press conference November 13th. Oda, Tsurumi, Yoshikawa were there, announced the desertions, even showed a film they'd made interviewing the guys.
Bold move. And the U.S. Navy confirmed it the same day.
Then comes the escape. The sources describe Beheiren facilitating an illegal route, getting them onto a Soviet ship in Yokohama.
To Vladivostok, then Moscow, then Sweden.
That's the route described. And this whole affair led to another group being formed, the Association of the Intrepid Four.
Who was running these JTEC operations day to day?
Sources name Yukio Kurihara as the commander, with younger members like Yoshinobu Yoshioka, Fuminori Yamaguchi, and Naifumi Hiko actually doing the hands-on work.
But this kind of clandestine activity is risky.
Hugely. And sure enough, in 1968, according to the sources, an American intelligence agent, Rush Johnson, managed to infiltrate Beheiren, posed as a deserter.
And that led to problems.
Big problems. November 5th, 68, a deserter named Gerald Myers, who was with Johnson, gets arrested in Kushiro by Japanese police, handed straight over to the U.S. Navy.
Ouch. Any fallout from that?
Yeah, arrests followed. Fuminori Yamaguchi, who drove Myers, got arrested in February 69. He's later released, but the arrest was apparently based on Myers saying Yamaguchi had a gun, which the sources say was just a model gun.
A pretext arrest, maybe?
That's the implication. They call it a separate charge arrest. Takahashi's home was searched too, because Myers had hidden there briefly.
So did this infiltration change how J-Tech operated?
It seems so. Under Takahashi's leadership, they apparently shifted strategy, moved away from trying to get guys out of the country.
To doing what instead?
Focusing more on hiding them within Japan, producing propaganda like pamphlets aimed at GIs, and supporting the anti-war movements that were springing up around U.S. bases inside Japan.
It's interesting what the sources say about the legality. Helping a deserter itself wasn't technically a crime under Japanese law because of the status of forces agreement, SOFA.
Right, which is why you get these separate charge arrests for things like the model gun. But the sources are clear. The participants felt they were doing illegal things, especially arranging secret departures. And other actions during the escapes were definitely illegal under Japanese law.
And despite all the effort, how successful was this escape operation overall?
The sources conclude, well, not very. Only a small number actually made it abroad secretly. Many ended up returning to the U.S. military eventually.
Okay, so by the early 70s, Beheiren's focus starts to broaden out again. Beyond just Vietnam.
Yeah, it seems like it. From 1971, they start protesting Japanese companies more directly.
Like the anti-war one shareholder movement. Targeting Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, seen as a symbol of the defense industry. Around 250 protesters tried to get into a shareholder meeting.
And they were met with resistance.
Big time. Sources mention about 500 Sokaya corporate muscle, basically, and right-wingers that Mitsubishi apparently mobilized.
Wow. And they protested other companies too. Yeah, firms expanding into South Vietnam, like Sony. The slogan was something like, "Do not allow Japan's reinvasion."
And by 73, it's even broader. Pollution, development.
Exactly. Getting involved in anti-pollution protests, like against Kyushu Electric Power. And the Sanrizuka struggle to fight against Narita Airport construction.
So it's really morphing into a wider, sort of left-leaning citizens movement by this point.
That's the picture the sources paint. And they also note that some former members later joined more explicitly radical groups, like the East Asia Anti-Japan Armed Front.
Okay, now we need to address something. Well, quite sensitive that the sources bring up, especially based on documents that emerged after the Soviet Union collapsed.
Right, the Soviet connection.
What do the sources say exactly?
They indicate that Yuichi Yoshikawa approached people identified as KGB representatives back in early 1968.
To ask for what?
Financial help, specifically for the deserter support work for J-Tech.
And this went high up.
Apparently so. The sources mention a report from the KGB chairman himself, Yuri Andropov, to the Soviet Communist Party leadership.
And Andropov
recommending support for Beheiren, material assistance, the works, the stated goals, expand anti-war propaganda, and, crucially, facilitate the illegal transport of U.S. deserters out of Japan, though not directly to the USSR at that point.
So did this support actually happen?
The sources state that yes, KGB agents working under embassy cover did help Beheiren leaders Oda, Takahashi, J-Tech members get a small number of deserters out to neutral countries, like Sweden.
And Yoshikawa's perspective on this?
Well, according to a journalist who interviewed him later, Yoshikawa reportedly admitted meeting Soviet embassy people, understood they were likely KGB.
And he was okay with that?
His reported stance was basically he'd accept help from anyone KGB or spy were his alleged words if it got deserters out of Japan.
But this cooperation didn't last indefinitely.
No. The sources suggest the Rush-Johnson infiltration might have disrupted the Soviet route, but they also say the cooperation kind of fizzled out because the KGB got pickier.
Pickier how?
Reportedly only wanting to help soldiers who'd worked in important secret departments, not just any deserter.
And did this Soviet connection, or maybe the perception of it, affect Beheiren itself?
The sources argue it did. They note that many conservatives, non-leftists, even some early key figures like Ken Kaiko, drifted away around the time the movement's ideology seemed to be hardening.
After 67, in Kaiko's case.
Right. And some sources, including a view attributed to Shintaro Ishihara, explicitly suggest that this Soviet funding or support played a role in that shift, in deepening that ideological color.
It adds another layer of complexity, for sure. So how did it all finally end? What led to the dissolution?
The main trigger, according to all the sources, was the Paris Peace Accords, signed January 27th, 1973, ceasefire in Vietnam.
The primary reason for Beheiren's existence was suddenly gone.
Pretty much. And as we discussed, public interest in Japan was already moving towards other things anyway, pollution, development issues. The momentum wasn't there anymore for Vietnam protest.
So they formally wrapped it up.
Yes. January 26, 1974. They held a dissolution meeting. About 600 people attended. Key figures like Yoshikawa, Muto, Tsurumi spoke.
And the final act.
A final demonstration the next day, January 27th. About 200 people, and that was it. Beheiren's activities concluded.
So the sources mentioned that wasn't quite the end of the story for the individuals involved.
No, apparently disagreements continued among former core members afterwards, particularly over things like the Cultural Revolution in China or the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia. Different perspectives emerged.
So if we pull back and look at the whole arc based on these sources,
Yeah.
you go from this tiny anti-treaty group
To this huge, sprawling, incredibly diverse, and yeah, definitely controversial citizens movement focused on Vietnam.
and the sources really highlight those unique features, don't they?
Yeah.
That super open, come-as-you-are structure.
The sheer mix of people involved crossing all sorts of lines.
That dual nature, the very public protests on one hand, and the secret illegal deserter aid on the other.
And then this whole complicated layer of the alleged Soviet connection revealed later.
So maybe some key takeaways for you, the listener. You see the power, potentially, of citizens organizing outside traditional structures.
But also the real challenges. Keeping unity, keeping focus in something so loose. And the controversies that can flare up when movements operate on the edges or interact with, well, foreign powers.
It's a fascinating snapshot of a particular time and a movement that's hard to neatly categorize.
Definitely. Which brings us, I suppose, to a final thought for you to consider based on all this.
Yeah, maybe something to mull over. What actually defines the boundaries of a citizens' movement? And how do the methods use things like, helping people leave illegally or accepting support from a foreign state, as these sources describe? How do those actions challenge or shape or maybe redefine what that movement is and what its legacy becomes?